And here we go. Welcome to technical session number 3, where we are going to be taking a tour through the inside of a computer, hopefully not a 3-hour tour. And we will be kind of getting to know and familiarizing ourselves a little bit with the geography and the basic components that you'll see on the inside of a computer. Some of the ones we are looking at are going to be a little bit dated, they're a little bit old, but the information is still relevant. And in fact, some of the older ones make it a little bit easier to point out the components. But much of the geography is still the same. Some minor things are changing along the way, but we will be pointing that out as we go. So for this particular technical session, our objectives are to describe and identify key components inside of a personal computer case. So in this one, we were talking about a tower or a standard computer, not a laptop or an all-in-one. This is a desktop. We're going to be naming the steps for taking the computer safely apart, stripping it all the way down to an empty case, and then putting the steps back together. We are also, throughout the course of this, through several technical sessions, we're going to be talking about the steps to replacing RAM, the steps to replacing a motherboard, the steps to replacing a power supply. Hint, hint, a lot of them are the same. It's just at what level do you stop? So we use a lot of the same methods and procedures when we are cracking open the case and working on the computer itself. All right, so BSMs we want to keep in mind with this particular session is teamwork, as IT is a team sport. On your team, you're going to have varying levels of skill sets, and skills are going to be in different areas. You need to be able to appropriately apply these so that your team can be as efficient as possible, and also being able to learn and develop with each other, do some cross-training, add to your skill bank. Every problem you know how to solve is another tool in your toolbox. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the more valuable you become to your team. And future orientation. Hopefully we have a good idea of where we are now and a good idea where we want to go. But we have to always maintain the thoughts that our actions now and what are we doing now that are going to be pushing us towards that ultimate goal of where we want to be. So, getting started. The computer case, also known as the chassis. This is the outer shell. It's either a plastic or metal or plexiglass cover that keeps all the components safe from shock, also allows for more efficient cooling, all that kind of fun stuff. The case itself can either sit horizontally on the desktop or vertically. Some cases have the option to do both. For those of you who are gamers out there and you like the Xbox or the PlayStation, they also had similar options. You could either have them laying horizontally or kicked up on their side, depending on what would be the best space-saving option for you. All-in-one cases, that's basically, it's, everything for the computer is all inside of the monitor. You only have one plug it in. Those are nice, they're convenient, they're easy to set up, all that wonderful stuff. They are terrible with regards to upgrading. It's, generally not user-friendly to do upgrades on these. You typically would only upgrade RAM, and then in few instances, some other components. In that essence, it's more like a laptop. For the purposes of this, if it's meant to only stand vertically, we call it a tower. Desktop case could lie horizontal or vertically. So on the outside of the case, what do we typically see? Drives. You see your CD, DVD, Blu-ray, though not so much. These are becoming what's called legacy technologies. So we're seeing them less and less and less, and a lot of it has to do with the amount of storage capabilities they have. So they're kind of being phased out. A lot of newer towers typically will not have optical drives on them. They'll just have USB drives or USB slots. They'll swap it out for that because operating systems and things like that are now getting to the point where they're exceeding the storage capacity of these optical drives. Also in the front, you'll see some USB, as we just talked about. These are 2.0 type A, and then some audio components, as you can see down here, which would use the 1/8 inch jack. All right. So once we peel the case back a little bit, look a little bit chaotic. But we have a lot of similar components. Most cases, when you open them up, they will look much like this. Slightly different, but you will become more and more comfortable with the layout or geography of the inside of the computer. Some things will be easy to point out. You have a big metal box, typically on the other side of the back of the computer where the plug goes in. This is your power supply. This will convert the AC voltage coming in from the wall and change it into a usable DC voltage that your computer components can utilize. We will be going over a lot of these components individually. This is just kind of an introduction. So don't scramble too hard to get everything, written down at one time. This is a good one to kind of take a little bit of a screenshot on if you wish. We will be dropping the student paste in Slack here in a few minutes, so you'll have a copy of these slides as well. Next thing that would kind of come to our attention, sort of the biggest components on the motherboard right here, looks like a giant fan sitting in the middle. And this is the cooling fan for your central processing unit, or CPU, the brain of your computer. And that is sitting on this giant circuit board right here. And this is referred to as your motherboard or MOBO. And this is where a lot of the hardware components would connect to your computer. Your motherboard is kind of like the backbone or nervous system of your computer. Everything goes through there. We'll get into more of the components on the motherboard in a few slides, but there's certain things you can see, like you can see your memory modules here. You have some PCIe connectors here. You have your North Bridge right here. We'll get into all these as we go, and then even more detail tomorrow when we talk about motherboards. Towards the front of it, you have your drive bays. So this could be an optical drive or a disk drive if you have an older computer or you need to utilize these older components, or it could just be hard drives. So it could be additional storage that you're adding to your computer as well. And we have a few different types of connectors we can use to hook these up. Most common now are what are called the SATA or SATA. And these right here, these red cables are typically your SATA cables. Questions so far? We're just starting to just kind of point at things and get a little bit, start putting names to items we're seeing.
Could you repeat what the SATA cables for?
SATA cables are your most common connectors for drives nowadays. So this could be optical drives, this could be hard drives, more typically hard drives, because again, the opticals are becoming more legacy or being phased out. So here you go. And these connectors will have a distinctive L-shaped connector on them, and we will show you that as we move forward. Any other questions so far? All right. Take a look at a motherboard with a little bit more detail. So right here, we can see these two long ports right here, and this is for additional memory for the computer, otherwise known as RAM, which is our volatile or short-term memory. Obviously, this is an older board. Boards nowadays will tend to have 4 to 6 slots in them. Some can go even more than that. But this is one of our most identifiable pieces. Here's the centerpiece right here, which in the previous slide, we saw that big fan sitting on top of it. But this is a CPU socket. And typically on top of it, you would have a CPU, a heat sink sitting on top of that, which a heat sink looks like this. It's a bunch of little metal fins sticking up, which aids in cooling. And then on top of that CPU or heatsink, you would have a fan forcing air through it to cool it down. Again, I think I mentioned it before, the CPU itself can go from room temperature to over 500 degrees in about 2 seconds. So it heats up really fast. We need to have an efficient way of dispersing that heat. Beyond that, we have this big connector over here, has really fat pin ports on it. And this is our P1, so power 1, our primary power supply. And it generally comes in a 20+4 configuration. So 20 pins plus 4. That is our P1 power supply. Next to that, you see these little rectangular tabs. There's a black one and a blue one here. And these are IDE connectors, otherwise known as floppy drive connectors, or PATA. So before we talked about SATA, which was SATA, this is PATA, P-A-T-A. This is an older connection type. And the cables tend to look like a flat ribbon. We'll show you examples of this going like later on when we talk about motherboards. But again, this is typically used for hard drives or floppy drives, older ones. Next to our CPU, on a motherboard, much like real estate, it's location, location, location. So the closer an item is to the CPU, the faster communication it can have. You know, we usually measure this in nanoseconds, but there's an item here called the North Bridge, and it is usually the largest heatsink closest to the CPU. Modern motherboards, however, we will talk about this tomorrow, but modern motherboards have integrated the North Bridge into the CPU. So they've managed to eliminate the distance and they've integrated it into the chipset that you use for the central processing unit. A little bit further away, the next largest chipset you'll see here is the South Bridge. North Bridge and South Bridge hold very specific functions. Typically your input output, so your USB drives, your keyboards, mice, stuff like that, slower communication items would go through your South Bridge. Faster communication items like your memory, your short-term memory, your RAM, graphics cards, things like that would go through the North Bridge because they need the fastest communication to the CPU. So faster communicating items go through the North Bridge, slower through the South Bridge. Again, we will be talking about this in more detail tomorrow going forward. This is just an introduction. All right, CMOS battery right here looks like a little watch battery, about the size, you know, a little bit smaller than a quarter. This basically keeps a trickle of power to your RAM for your BIOS, so that all the settings for your BIOS are maintained. The thing with volatile memory, which we'll go to a lot later, is the memory is maintained so long as power is going to the memory. Once power cuts off, everything is erased. So, but we will talk about that more tomorrow as well when we get into RAM. Right here, you see a bunch of connection ports, which if you looked at the back of your computer, all of these would look kind of familiar to you to a degree, because this part of the motherboard actually would stick out the back of your computer. So you've got your audio connectors, which look like your headphone jacks, otherwise known as 1/8 inch jacks. You got some USBs here. You have a network connection or an RJ45 right here. You got your DB15, which is an old school monitor, and you have your PS2 connectors, which are good for your keyboard and mouse. These are older connectors. We will be going over these again. This is just kind of showing when you look at the back of the computer, you've probably seen a lot of these before. All right, here's the same thing, just a different angle. make it kind of easier to see, you can see your P1 power connector right here, the 20+4. Got your CMOS battery right here, your memory modules for your RAM, and always on a motherboard, the RAM modules will run perpendicular to your expansion cards, so you do not confuse them. Expansion cards point out the back of the computer. Memory modules will run parallel with the back of the computer. So up here you can see these are the ports for the back that we just showed on this screen right here. So these things that we were looking at right here, this is them up here. Okay, and so whatever expansion cards you put in these slots right here, they would point out the back of the computer. There's little metal tabs that you can remove to add functionality to your computer, be it a graphics card, sound card, NICs. You know, there's a variety of things that you can install there. TV tuners, all kinds of stuff. Here is our Northbridge chipset. It is the largest heat sink closest to the CPU. We come back here. Here's our Northbridge right next to our CPU. Back here, Northbridge right next to our CPU. Any questions so far? Again, this is just initial exposure.
If you could reiterate what a PCIe is again, I forgot.
PCIe is an expansion slot. Well, they have a PCI, which is an older version, and then you have the PCIe, which is the more updated version. So if you see the cream colored ones, those tend to be the older ones. And then the shorter ones and the blue or black ones like this tend to be the newer updated PCI Express, which are a much faster communication medium. Over here, you can see these are all PCIs right here. And then they have another one here, which is, it's hard to see, but it is a brown color. And that's called the AGP, which is an accelerated graphics port. And this is where the earliest versions of graphics cards would go. So this actually communicated through the North Bridge rather than the old school PCI, which went through the South Bridge. And because typically it would be used to adding a NIC card, adding extra drives, extra storage, stuff like that. Sound cards, that would be your older PCIs. New PCIe is these three right here. These are your PCIes. And then you have an old cream colored PCI. Does that make sense, Henry? Again, early exposure.
Yep.
So we're going to be going over a lot of this stuff multiple times, and we're going to be going into each of these components like the CPU, the RAM, power supply, drives, and stuff like that. We're going to have individual sessions on each of these to do a little bit deeper dive. All right, here's a little bit, I hate it when they put it on angle like this, but then here's another look at the ports on the back. So we have all of our audio ports over here. So this would be like microphones, speakers, headphones. If you had surround sound, stuff like that, you can utilize it. And then there's this little squarish type port right here, down in the bottom. And that is a fiber optic audio set. Over here, we can see the familiar USB connectors. You have some over here and some over here. The ones that are black, those are USB 2.0. So that's an older USB technology. When you have the light blue, when you see them here, this is a newer USB technology. This is USB 3.0. So, and it is significantly faster. Right above the USB 3.0, the blues, you have this thing, this connector up here looks almost like an arrow. And this is called a firewire. So this was faster than USB technology up until the advent of the USB-C. This was very frequently used for hard drives. I have a few of these still laying around because it was a very fast hard drive technology. And if there's any Nintendo DS fans out there, This was also the same cable you would use to connect two DSs together for networking. Beyond that, the ever familiar HDMI, if you've ever set up your TV to a cable box or a VCR or an Apple TV or a Roku or whatever, this is your HDMI port right here. We have another display module, a DVI video port, which we'll get into a little bit. This one has kind of fallen off of the exam, but we still need to be able to identify it at least. Oh, they had one on the PS2 console as well? I did not know that, Jose. Nice. All right, network connector right here for your Ethernet cables. And then you have some more USBs that we talked about. And then down here on the bottom, we have a SATA or an eSATA. So eSATA. So we have the internal SATA, which was for hard drives. This is the external version. So the E stands for external on this. So eSATA. We'll show a little bit better picture of this one as we go forward. On modern computers, you can either use it as an eSATA port or as a USB 3 port. So it is a multi-use port. And then there is a newer display port on the bottom as well. Any questions so far? Again, just early exposure. First pass.
I have a question.
Yes.
What are the difference between SATA and USB?
It's essentially the technology involved.
Mm-hmm.
So Universal Serial Bus is, it's basically they're made by different companies, but they allowed crossover, and it's going to be transfer speeds as well, and where they hook up. So SATA drives internally, they have that L shape, different connector, but they have different protocols that they run on, and they operate at different speeds. So for the purposes of this, we need to be able to identify them by their shape and color, essentially. And then kind of, to a degree, know the speeds that we're dealing with.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, processors, brain of the computer. For the purposes of this, they have two main ones that they deal with. You have Intel and AMD. Those were the two big players up until recently. Now we have the ARM processors, but we will get into those tomorrow with regards to motherboards and stuff, or when we get into processors next week. So there is a third option, but these still are two of the biggest players. The ARM processors are typically used in smaller laptops, mobile devices, and things like that, where these are kind of the big players. So Intel and AMD, they have a different appearance to them, and we do need to be able to be aware of it. And you should be able to look at a motherboard and tell whether or not that motherboard is an Intel motherboard or an AMD motherboard. We will talk about why, but basically Intel, the chips are flat, and there's a bunch of pins that stick up out of the motherboard, and they call that LGA. AMD, the pins stick down out of the motherboard, or excuse me, out of the processor, and the motherboard has a bunch of pin holes in it that the pins slip down into. If you remember the story I told you about one of the TAs in my class that I went through dropping the chip on the edge of the computer and bending the pins, it was an AMD chip that they dropped. And that is a PGA, or pin grid array. We will talk about that when we get to processors.
Qualcomm also have a processor, right?
You what? What was that, Mijan? Or Mijin, sorry.
Qualcomm company.
Qualcomm?
Yeah.
I think those are the ARM processors you're talking about. But the two big players that, the main players that we're talking about are your Intels and your AMDs right now. And again, these are essentially like the brain of the computer. Most of the computational power that your computer have resides within these chipsets. Now, with all of that, we have to be able to cool these things down because you push electricity through any item and it generates heat. So we have the heat sinks, which look like these little metal fins sticking up. Give me a good picture here. Here we go. These little metal fins sticking up. And if there is no fan on top of it, that is referred to as passive cooling, meaning we're not doing anything extra. We just rely upon the fins to draw the heat away from the chips and disperse the heat into the air. Then we have active cooling. There's a few different versions we will talk about, but just for the purposes of this, you would see a fan sitting on top of the heatsink, and that would push the air through the fan, accelerating the cooling process and making it a little bit more efficient. And then you have case fans, which are attached to generally the front and the rear of the computer to efficiently move air through the computer or server or what have you. A lot of them have these case fans hooked up to them because they draw cool air in through the front and they push hot air out through the back. Mental note or word of note, if you have a laptop, it's not appropriately named. It should not be sitting on your lap. It should not be sitting on a towel, on your bed, on a pillow, or any of that stuff, because you're suffocating the computer and it will heat up. And eventually you will damage the components inside the computer by having it sitting on your lap or whatnot. It needs to be set on a flat surface with nothing underneath it. It's like a tabletop or a desk or something along those lines. All right.
I have a question.
Yes, Vishal.
Is the case fans and the heatsink, is those usually used for like computers, and the passive cooling is more so for like cell phones? Because the
Well, they do
passive cooling
utilize,
for-
yeah, they don't typically use a fan cooling system for cell phones or for tablets. They do typically use heat sinks and stuff for passive cooling. You are absolutely correct on that. But yeah, the case fans and stuff would be typically more laptops, desktops, things like that, notebooks, along those lines.
Okay.
Good
I'm a
observation.
little bit confused on the difference between heat sinks and your passive cooling, or like because
Well,
I know on the processor you have to
Mhm.
have either a fan or a heat sink on there to disperse it.
We'll typically have
So-
both on a CPU.
Okay, so it's both. Okay.
So it's like a sandwich. They put a processor down, they put a heat sink on top of it, and then a fan on top of the heat sink, pushing the air through the heat sink, forcing the air through it.
Right.
And
then
what
you
they
have
and passive cooling is just a heat sink.
okay, thank you.
So that would be like your North Bridge, where it's just a heat sink just sitting there, nothing really pushing it or any additional air across it. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Also, mental note, if I explain something and it makes it worse, tell me so I can explain it a different way. Yeah, they do have those knee boards or whatever, the lap boards where they have like the padded under part and then the hard top. And you can sit on them. Yeah, those work great, but that is a way to do it. But most people don't do that. They just literally plop the laptop right on their board. Yes, Madhusha, yeah, thermal paste is a part of that sandwich, but we'll get into that tomorrow. But good catch. The thermal paste goes between the CPU and the heatsink.
So what are some other methods for cooling down your PC?
We will get into that when we talk about it, but there's other methods like you can do liquid cooling, which a lot of gamers tend to use when they're having a higher heat processing. So you have liquid cooling, you have the CPU and heat sink. They have submerged cooling, where you literally would take the computer and submerge it into a liquid. And that would actually cool it. That's one of the most efficient ways to do it. They do have like liquid nitrogen cooling for like supercomputers and stuff like that. So there's a variety of methods that people use. But when we get into power supplies, I believe they have a section in there specifically about cooling.
Okay.
So and they got some pictures for some of the stuff, and it's kind of neat.
Isn't that like them gaming computers where it looked like it's underwater or something like that?
Well, typically, like the gaming ones will have the tubes of liquid running through it, cooling different components like your GPU and the CPU and stuff like that. But they don't typically go the level of submerged computer. But some people do, because when you're building computers, a lot of times, like especially if it's something that you really take pride in, it becomes almost like a work of art. It's like people's cars. Some people just use cars as a way to get to A and B. Some people like to really soup up their car and give it
And
character and
modify.
personality and all that kind of stuff. It's the same thing with computers. So computers can almost rise to the level of art pieces with the level of detail and aesthetics that they put into it.
Okay.
With lighting and colors and stuff like that. Good question, though. All right. Memory modules, AKA RAM, or virtual memory, not virtual memory, volatile memory, sorry. So volatile, meaning it loses its data once the power is turned off. That's what we mean by volatile memory. We'll mention that again. And we need to start getting into the habit of when we talk about the computers, when we say memory, we mean RAM. So when you say you're running out of memory, you're running out of RAM. But a lot of people say I'm running out of memory when they're running out of hard drive space or storage. So hard drive space we will refer to as storage. RAM we refer to as memory. It makes it very easy for us to understand what we're talking about. There is no confusion. Unfortunately, or as it is when we talk with people who are not in the field, when they say memory, a lot of times they're meaning hard drive space. But we got to start working on getting into the habit here of distinguishing the two. All right. So here's a quick look at some RAM modules. They are installed down into those ports on the motherboard, and they utilize these locking clips to kind of hold them in place and let you know that they're seated properly. And the speed, size, type, or whatever that you're allowed to use would be determined by the motherboard you're using and the, or the operating system you're using. So the chip architecture, the motherboard, the operating system, all would determine how much RAM you can actually install in a computer. All right. With RAM modules, the nice thing about these is there's almost a cascading effect. When you upgrade RAM in one computer, you hold on to it because likely you can utilize that in another computer to upgrade another computer. So as new RAM modules come in, you update your newest machines, then you take your RAM from your newest machines, move them down to your older machines, and you kind of give everybody an upgrade on the way down. While we're doing that kind of stuff, if we ever have RAM in storage, we would keep them in anti-static bags to prevent ESD from damaging these highly sensitive chips on the RAM modules. Modern RAM, a lot of times, especially ones that go into gaming machines and stuff like that, are enclosed in a case. So they're a little bit more protected. Some of them even have RGB or red, green, blue LED lights that run along the RAM modules as well. So, there's different ways that you can do upgrades and stuff like that if you wish. And these boards on the top, never touch them with your finger or a magnetized screwdriver. That can severely damage them. Also, the gold pins along the side right here, the oils in our skin can cause those to corrode and damage them from being usable. So we don't touch the metal pins on the bottom or the chips on the top. We hold them from the edges. Questions, comments, concerns?
Back
So
in the day,
ROM,
Oh, we got two.
go ahead.
no, I
Quick,
was
Kurt.
gonna ask, so ROM isn't used anymore?
Oh, RAM is absolutely used nowadays.
No,
What I'm
ROM.
saying is the newer versions of RAM, like the, The most recently produced ones will have a case that sits around them. So you wouldn't see these chips on the side. There would be a case around it.
No, I mean the ROM, the read-only memory. That's no longer used.
Oh no, we still use it, but it's kind of one of those things where ROM is a little bit of a misnomer, where we can write to it, but it's still called ROM. So we'll get into that when we talk about EEPROM and EEPROM when we get into memory, so RAM. So we'll talk about it tomorrow.
Okay.
But yeah, ROM is still used. It's just looks a little bit different than it used to, kind of thing. Jose, did you have a question?
Yeah, does that rule still apply? I know back in the day, we had 4 slots and you had two RAM sticks.
Mhm.
You wouldn't actually install them together. You will install one slot and skip a slot and put it like one,
Yeah, you would put them in banks 1 and 3 and 2 and 4 rather than 1 and 2.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, does that still apply?
To a degree, yes, that still applies, but it depends on the manufacturer because some manufacturers do things differently. But for the most part, yes, you are correct. Where you wouldn't put RAM modules in 1 and 2 and then 3 and 4 because they set up these RAM banks what they call dual channel or triple channel memory, where multiple RAM modules can operate like one. So it allows them to be more efficient. But we'll talk about that when we get into RAM tomorrow in a little more detail, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Closed mouths don't get fed. All right. All right. Next, drive types. So we have a variety that we'll come across on a regular basis. You have optical drives, which we mentioned briefly earlier. You know, that encompasses your really old CDs, semi-old DVDs, and the recently old Blu-rays. And so these drives would be, like I said, kind of phasing out. You're not seeing them as often anymore on newer machines, but you still will come across these pretty regularly in the wild as an IT specialist. And then you have 2 different types of storage. We have the older HDD or hard disk drive, also known as mechanical drives, because you can hear the platters in them spin up. You can hear the arms moving back and forth inside, reading and writing. And they have mechanical parts. So we refer to them as mechanical drives. These are still used today at a pretty regular level because on a per gigabyte level, they are still significantly less expensive than solid state drives. So solid state drives, they have no mechanical parts in them. And this is what we refer to as flash memory. So if you've ever used a USB stick, that is essentially similar technology. There's no moving parts in it. It's just able to read and write from memory chips. And that would be considered a solid state drive. These are being used a lot more frequently in things like laptops, tablets, mobile phones, things like that, because they're more shock resistant than the old school hard disk drives. But again, unfortunately, per gigabyte memory is more expensive. The gap is closing on that, but it's still more economical to go with the hard disk drive for large capacity storage. Questions on this? Again, this is just an introduction. We're going to do a whole lesson just on drives.
Real quick, I do remember hearing a ratio of the more expensive, the faster. Or the more expensive, the better. I don't know in what sense it's better. When you say
and
expensive,
again,
you mean like
that's
in
kind of a
cost, right?
misnomer. Because to a degree, there is the saying, you get what you pay for. But there are still companies out there that are going to try to sell you a Honda at Lamborghini prices because, you know, maybe somebody will pay for it thinking that it's, you know, better because it's more expensive. You know,
It's a
and
hidden-
sometimes they make it seem like it's more, you know, it's more expensive or more robust than it actually is. Anybody out there have Beats headphones or like Beats headphones? They feel more robust when you have the cans around the ears. You know, they got that weight to them. They feel like they're more substantial. It's a good technology. I'm not going to knock them. You know, they do have a good sound quality to them and all that stuff. But did you know that like a huge portion, I think it's like 60% of the weight is washers, like extra like little metal washers and stuff they put inside of it to make it feel heavier so that you have the perception that they are more substantial or robust in construction than another brand, which is going to be lighter weight.
I think
So
for
they actually
SSD,
built- You what?
no, say on in SSD, I know the expensive ones are like when it comes to the new NB technology, like the NB 4.0, and of course anything that's released brand new is going to cost an arm and a leg.
Yes.
So a lot of that does give you better speeds, of course, you know, but once, you know, a couple time passes by, you slowly start seeing those prices. I know, like, for example, the 980 Pro Samsung is NB 4.0 with a 2 terabyte used to cost $430.
Mhm.
Now it's like around 250. So
And that's as other people start entering the market, competition drives it down. You get economies of scale. When you're able to make much more of them, you can make them at a cheaper price per unit. But, you know, kind of the point I was just getting at was the technology may be good, but it's one of those things where they add things that are unnecessary to make your perceptions of them more substantial. Like I heard a story the other day, and it was talking about cake mixes. Like anybody ever bake cake from a box? So go roll the clock back to like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, whatever. Everybody baked cakes from scratch. Well, they came out with a newer way to mix it together, and they started selling cakes in a box. And all you had to do was add water, mix it up, and go, because they had the powdered eggs in there, powdered milk, all that kind of fun stuff. And they put it all together in one mix. All you had to do was add water and go. Nobody would buy them because they felt that you couldn't do that just in a box. So what they did was they just changed it a little bit and now make it so you add eggs, oil, and water or milk. And now people buy them all the time because it feels like cooking. Before it didn't feel like cooking because you just added water. So as the technology improves, some people may not want to adopt the technologies because they don't believe it's worthwhile or it's actually capable of doing what it wants to do. So manufacturers may have to make adjustments. But yes, in the chat, SSDs, less noise than HD because you don't have the mechanical parts, you don't have the spinning platters and all that fun stuff. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, revelations? Is it starting to feel real yet? All right. Continue our journey a little bit. Expansion slots. We showed this on the board. This would be your PCI or PCIe or AGP slots. Again, they point out the back of the computer. You see these little metal tabs that you would pull out as you would add an expansion slot to the computer itself. Some of you may be thinking if you just remove some of those slots, it would be able to cool the computer even better because more airflow means more cooling. This is actually incorrect because this actually would make the transfer of air in the fans worse because it doesn't have the pull that it normally would. So if there is no slot installed, please make sure you have a metal tab installed in that gap so that efficient cooling can still take place. But again, expansion slots add functionality to your computer, can expand the life. This could be additional hard drives. This could be sound cards to do like 3D sound, or if you're doing sound mixing with MIDI devices and stuff like that with music. It could be TV tuners for video editing. It could be additional drives. It could be graphics cards for using CAD or CAM programs for engineering, or for graphics design or animation, things like that, or even video games if that's your thing. Sean, optical drives can be both. So an optical drive can be an input. It can also be an output. All right, so here's a breakdown of some expansion slots. So you have the PCI, which stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. Old school technology. It says it can be used for graphics, but almost nobody uses them for this because it is far too slow. It is usually more utilized for audio, USB add-ons, networking, like adding NIC cards, and other lower level expansions. Now, they wanted to add graphics cards so that they could increase the, gaming capabilities and animation and all that kind of fun stuff. So the new technology they came up with was called a AGP. It's easier to see the brownish color in it right here. And so the accelerated graphics port was predominantly put in place to use for graphics cards. It does still have some use, although again, it's kind of rare to see them nowadays. Now, the new super fast, high-speed technology that we utilize today is the PCIe, or Peripheral Component Interconnect Express. So remember, E on PCI is express, E on eSATA is external. I, for some reason, got those confused when I was going through the class, so I was trying to remember to remind people about that one. This is the much more modern one. This is going to be your most updated 3D graphics cards, much faster communication. It goes through the North Bridge, and most expansion items nowadays typically go through this channel. Questions so far? We will see and talk about this stuff again. So again, just an introduction. Kind of a summary of the course going forward for 1100 or 1101, excuse me. All right, expansion cards. Here's a kind of a look at one. Yes, this thing is old, but this is an old video card or graphics card. When you look at it, it almost looks like a motherboard. So you have your central processing unit on here. It is called a GPU instead of a CPU. So this would be a graphics processor unit. It has its own little heat sinks on it right here. We have these little battery things sticking up from it, which are called capacitors. And this stores residual charge in the computer. And then we can see the pins on the side here where it would lock down into our expansion slot. So it would lock down into here and then point out the back of the computer. And then we have a variety of outputs. We have a DVI right here. We have a DB15 or VGA, depending on who you're talking to. And then we have our S2 video output as well, which was kind of a bridging technology as well. Questions on this? This is just a basic look at an expansion card. Graphics card nowadays, kind of like the RAM modules that we were talking about, they're usually encased now. So like they usually have a case going around them, and the only thing that's really sticking out is you have the video ports at the back, and then your pins. And it'll be an enclosed case where you have venting for the fans, and that's about it. So they're a little safer, and they're able to cool a little more efficiently.
Did you say graphics or graphic cards are an example of an expansion card, or are they just same thing, different name?
They're an example of an expansion card.
Okay.
Because like we can do an audio expansion card. We could do a network expansion card. We can do additional hard drives through expansion cards. So there's a variety of things that we can expand the capabilities of the computer with. Graphics card is just one of them. All right, power supply. I hate this slide for one very important reason. So All right. So power supply itself converts the AC voltage out of your wall into a usable DC voltage for your computer. As we talked about last week, I believe, in the US, we use voltages that come out. They're somewhere between 110 to 115. And then in the vast majority of the rest of the world, they use 220 to 230. On the back of a CPU or a PSU, excuse me, power supply, there are some power supplies that can only do one or the other. Those are rare. Many will have what's called a selector switch. And so before you plug it in, you would select whether it's going to be receiving 110 or 220. If I have it set for 110 and I plug it into a 220 outlet, what do you think is going to happen?
Not enough power to turn on.
It's expecting 110, it's receiving 220.
Oh,
burn
so
some up.
fried.
Am I
Fried.
short?
Yeah. You can fry some of your components if you have the wrong setting on there. If I go to Europe or Africa or South America or whatever, and I have a 220 outlet and I plug a 110 in there, what's going to happen?
It will not turn on.
Best case scenario, it doesn't turn on.
Right.
Hopefully it doesn't blow up. That would be bad. If it does turn on, it may not have enough power to run all the components. So it may barely turn on, but you're not going to get much functionality out of it. So that's the danger, so to speak, of the selector switch. A lot of modern PSUs have automatic switching. So once it senses what's coming from the wall, it auto selects which one it should need. So it's nice, makes things a little bit easier for us. Now, I want you to take note of this. This will happen on a test. This will happen on a quiz. You will see this multiple times. There are 5 varieties of voltages that you can see or receive from a power supply. You can get positive or negative 12 volts, positive or negative 5 volts, or positive 3.3. All components that get installed into a computer receiving power directly from the power supply have to operate on one of these 5 voltages. So please write that down. You're going to need it.
You said positive 3.35 or just 3.3?
Positive 3.3,
Okay.
positive or negative 5, and positive or negative 12. So that's 5 different voltages. And the reason I put that scribble there is they put a little hash mark like right here, so it looks like it's negative and positive 3.3. I don't like the way they set it up.
Yeah, you guys might see that for sure on the test.
Definitely, maybe.
Mhm.
No, so it takes from the wall your
Mhm.
110 or 220 and then converts it to the 3.3 or 5 or the 12.
And it converts it from AC, which is short for alternating current, to DC, which is direct current. So it converts the type of power and then the voltages that each is going to receive. And how we measure what kind of power supply we need by all of our components is measured in watts. And that is volts times amps equal watts.
Can you say that again? Volts times?
Amps equal watts. And an old electrician told me you can swim in an ocean of voltage, but a single amp can kill you. Which is why when we touch a doorknob and it's 10,000 volts, when we see that little spark go across, it may surprise us, but it's not really going to harm us. But you take 220 and put 6 amps through it, and it can be fatal. So things to pay attention to when we're dealing with electricity. This is part of why we say before we work on it, make sure we unplug it, disconnect it, and then disperse the residual power like we talked about yesterday or last week.
And ground yourself.
And ground yourself, yes. All right, everybody get this written down? We feel good? Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Get my randomizer here. All right. Joseph, can you please tell me what is this component in the upper left? What are we looking at?
I'm sorry, I'm here. I'm on my tablet, so I'm not getting everything all in one screen, so I'm jumping back and forth. Could you say that again? It's chip.
Yeah, well, what is that component called in the upper left? So it is a chip.
Right.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I didn't say anything further.
Okay.
I know the chip, and we also had the metal piece that kind of looked like that. That was kind of like a heat. Oh man.
So let's think of this as the main chip. What would we call it?
Look at my notes.
No problem.
I
You
don't
can always phone a friend if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask somebody.
Who'd you like to ask? Yeah, I'm always drawn to the ones where the cameras are off. So
Is that the
CPU.
is that
Right,
the is that the Intel?
Yeah, that absolutely is an Intel. Very good.
Okay,
So who said CPU?
Wasn't me.
Yeah,
I
it wasn't
did.
me.
Savvy.
It was
Savvy.
savvy.
Nice work. So yeah, this is our CPU, the upper left. Nice. So we got here, Chris. What do we have in the upper middle here? Upper middle. Sure, is Chris here? Not seeing him.
Sorry, I always forget to.
Oh, there you are. There you are. There you are. So what do you got in the upper middle here?
Yeah, we were just talking about it, but I don't remember the name, to be honest. I have to look back at it.
Yes. Remember, we gotta get used to kind of being okay with sometimes we're gonna be wrong, and that's fine. Take a
Sure.
guess.
Is that the thing that helps kind of hold down the computer, the motherboard, I guess?
Well, this piece here, yeah, actually that would cool down this other component we're looking at here.
Okay.
We're looking at the whole component. It looks like a miniature motherboard almost.
Yeah, like a smaller version. Does it connect those ports to the motherboard, or?
Yeah, it does. I mean, these will get connected through these pins right here to the motherboard. Absolutely. And then you have these ports that would go out the back of the computer.
Yeah, I don't remember the main name, but I
Okay.
have to just take a look at it.
No problem. No problem. Emilio, what are we looking at?
Is it an expansion slot?
It is an well, and not the slot.
John?
The card itself. So the slot would be where we plugged it in, but very good, very good. So this is the expansion slot. And remember, we can have a variety of things on here like graphics cards, network cards, things like that. Archer.
Video card?
Yeah, this particular one is a graphics card. Very good. Excellent. Go to my cards here. So we got here. Tamika, can you please tell us what we're looking at here in the upper right-hand corner, right here, this metal box with a bunch of wires sticking out of it? What might that be?
Is that the power supply?
It absolutely is the power supply. Very good. So yeah, it's got our power supply. We see the plug in the back right here that would plug in. That little red square right there. Does everybody see that little red square? That's our selector switch. That will determine whether or not we have 110 or 220 voltage. It's that little red tab right there above the on-off power switch right here. So excellent. Nice work, Tamika. Meklit, what do we have on the bottom left right here? What is this piece right here?
Is that the CPN fan? The cooling fan?
Yes.
All right.
That is the heatsink and cooling fan for the CPU. Excellent.
So the
So
proper
CPU.
terminology is CPU fan or?
That would be a CPU fan, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Because it's sitting directly on top of a heatsink. If it was just a fan, you could just say fan.
Can we say CPU cooler?
Or
Does that
CPU
work?
fan, yeah.
Okay.
Or CPU cooling unit.
The fan will always be on top of the CPU, correct?
Depending on the cooling method you're using. So standard cooling would be a fan like this. So the majority of what you see will look like this. It'll be a fan on top of a heatsink. So that would be your standard cooling method. All right. T3 here. Nope. George, can you please tell me what is in the bottom center right here? Bottom center.
Is it the motherboard?
Not the motherboard, it's a little bit smaller.
Um,
But it will plug into the motherboard.
I know, I can't think of the name of it.
Got to find a way to kind of get this ingrained in our memory.
I know. Come on, give me a hint.
That was
Maybe,
a clue.
maybe kind of.
Oh, that was, somebody just told me. They said RAM.
It's a RAM.
That was
There we go,
good.
RAM, excellent, or volatile memory. So excellent. So yeah, we gotta. This is what adds more not necessarily more processing power, but us to be able to work on more things at one time, because this is our short-term storage. Again, we'll talk more and more detail about this tomorrow. But excellent,
sorry.
Esther. George. Yes, sorry, what was that?
I'm sorry, my camera just went off. I couldn't hear the audio. What was the answer for that one?
The bottom center one is RAM or memory module.
Thank you.
Not a problem. All right, Andre, there we go. Bottom right, what are we looking at here?
It's a battery.
It does look like a battery, but not particularly in this case. Got a little bit of a clue right here. If you can
Was
read
that
that.
SSD hard drive?
That would be a hard drive. Is that Kirk?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yes. This is a hard drive. Be our storage. Nice work. Good guess, Andre.
Quick
Ken.
question.
Yes.
For test purposes, if they use a picture like this, would it be better, would they go by calling it storage and not necessarily hard drive?
Typically, if they show a picture like this, they're gonna be looking for something like this is a SSD or an HDD. You know, they'll put a couple things in there. So like, or you know, But
So pretty much try to go with picture shows and
yes,
match it to that, right? Okay.
yeah, exactly.
So I have a quick question about the expansion slot.
Okay.
Are these found in these are not found in newer computers, right? It's mostly in
Yes.
desktop.
I mean,
Okay.
desktops, yes, but like laptops, minimally, tablets, and mobile devices, typically no. All-in-one
Okay.
devices, minimally. But yeah, desktops, towers, yes, you absolutely still see expansion cards nowadays. But yeah, the one on the bottom, yeah, for today's purposes, just a hard drive is fine. That's all we're looking for. So excellent. All right. So now we've kind of talked about components a little bit. We're going to talk about the steps of taking a computer apart, kind of just walking through that process. And some of the best practices when taking them apart. Yeah, visually they'll say something on them that'll say SSD or HDD, but typically SSDs are thinner and HDDs tend to be a little bit thicker, typically. But you'll get more and more exposure to them as we go. So once you get through with this, you might get excited. Yes, I want to get in there and break a computer apart, take it down to its case and just see how everything works. But from a perspective of an IT professional, if we're going to crack the case, we need to have a good reason. We don't want to be performing exploratory surgery. We need to have a justifiable reason why we're opening the case up and going in and messing around with certain components. So say we're about to do this, certain things we need to, have in place. First, we need to have a conversation with the customer, say, hey, we're going to be opening this sucker up, going in there, and we're going to be doing A, B, and C. So that's one. Two, we need to document everything as well. So we need to document what the state is of the exterior of the computer. If this thing looks like it's been sent down a flight of stairs, we want to make note of that before we open it up. There's a lot of dings, dents, and scratches on this case. It looks like it's had a rough go of it. I'm just letting you know that before we open it up. Make sure, we sign here. This is not damage that occurred in our office. So we're going to make documentation. So we want to, and then we also want to make sure we have backups of any data that is on there. Just in case things go wrong, we want to make sure that the data is all backed up. So we've got all this done. Awesome. We're ready to go. So we want to plan and organize our work. We want to have a clean work area where we're going to be taking these things apart, enough space where we can set components out without stacking them on top of each other. Because if you stack components on top of each other, you can cause an unintentional short, damaging the components. You can have an ESD, or electrostatic discharge, which can destroy chips on your components. We don't want to do that. If we're going to be taking something apart, there's one or two methods that we can use to document where everything is supposed to go. Can anybody give me one? If you wanted to document where everything is supposed to go, what's one way you can do this?
Take pictures before you do anything.
Pictures. That is hands down the easiest, most awesome way to do it. I am a horrible mechanic, and I have a tendency to take things apart and then get into trouble when I'm working on the car. And then my brother basically came to me and he goes, why don't you just take a picture of everything as you're taking it apart? And then when you're done, you just follow the pictures in reverse order. It's like, oh, that's a really easy and, simple thing I should have thought of. Same principle applies to computers. As you're taking components apart, you take pictures along the way. That way you know where everything goes. Don't be afraid to take a lot of pictures. You don't need to save them all. But you know where every plug goes, you know where every component goes, you know where every wire goes, and how they all fit together. It makes a nice, easy, roadmap for yourself to put things back together. The other way that they talk about, but I don't know anybody who does this, you could draw pictures. lay things out. Like you may want to draw a picture of the pinout for like the front panel connectors or something like that, because those can be really tiny and frustrating to deal with. But for the most part, people tend not to draw pictures, especially when the vast majority of us have a camera in our pocket at all times, right?
You can label them also.
Yeah, and you can label them as well. One of the things I do recommend if you're taking a picture, use something to orient yourself on the computer. You know, just for sake of argument, like a popsicle stick. I got one right here. This is my randomizer for the class. I put everybody's name in the bucket. But you can take a popsicle stick and put it on the top or the back of the computer. And every time you take a picture, wherever you see the popsicle stick, you know that's the back of the computer. So you don't get things turned around. So use something to orientate you. It could be a paper clip. It could be a pencil. It could be, you know, anything you have laying around, just something to let you know, like a compass, which way's up.
North. What you call it? I was wondering if like using zip ties is a good idea too, because there's many times where I like would unplug wires, like, you know, the red, white, and yellow wires.
Mhm.
And, you know, some devices take multiple of those.
Yes.
So it's like when you unplug them, then you get confused on, okay, which one went where?
So use the zip ties to like if you have like 3 plugs that go into one device, zip tie those 3 plugs together.
Yeah, or like if something goes on the left side, you zip tie those together. No, the days are for left.
I mean, yeah, you could do that. And that's kind of a way to do cable management if you wish. Because, you know, depending on the person, when they finish doing a computer, it could look like a bird's nest in there and can be very chaotic. And then there's other people who take a lot of pride in their cable management, and it just looks absolutely beautiful inside. And, you know, we'll kind of get into cable management just a little bit. I'll see if I can find the photo really quick. I'll only give it a couple seconds to look for it really quick. Can't find it, I'll move on until later. Yeah, I'll find it later. I'll show it to y'all for cable management. But yeah, you could use zip ties, and that could kind of help keep your cables organized if you wish. But I also would recommend augmenting that with photos as well. So before you reach in, you know, we talked about taking notes of all aspects. Draw a diagram of system placement, or take pictures, whichever you wish. The other thing is, if you're removing screws from a computer, this is not as important on desktops. They tend to use the same threadings and size, but on all laptops, mobile devices, phones, all that stuff, they have a nasty habit of each individual screw is a different thread and size. And if you put a long screw into a short threaded screw area, you could crack the screen on a phone. You could basically crack a chip or damage a chip, something like that. So you have to essentially create a map for yourself of where the screws go. And one way to do that, I have a mat that has a bunch of little holes in it, and I can lay the screws out in there in the order in which I do them. And I always take them off in the same order. I start in the upper left-hand corner and I work clockwise. That's my method. You need to create a method that works for you. The other thing you can do is draw just a rough outline of what the device looks like a rectangle. And then if you remove a screw from the upper left-hand corner, you draw a circle on the page and you put the screw in that little circle. And you can just draw little circles on a piece of paper and put the screws in those circles, and that'll tell you where they go when you come back. You know, those are 2 simple ways you can do what they call screw mapping to make sure you put the screws back in the places where they come from. Questions on this? All right, so we've done our pre-planning, we've documented the outside. Make sure we have our ESD mat, gloves, and/or bracelet ready to go when we crack the case. Tie back loose hair if you have any. And again, or never reach into a computer that is plugged in and powered on. Once we unplug it, turn it down, we unplug it, all that fun stuff. We press and hold the power button for about 5 seconds, and that will disperse any residual charge stored in the capacitors. They look like little batteries. So it disperses the charge, making it safe to work on. Is it foolproof? No, but we will avoid the components that are dangerous. Can anybody tell me one component that we never mess with because it could be dangerous to operate on?
Power supply.
Power supply. Excellent. Is there ever an instance where we're going to open the case on a power supply?
No.
Oh,
No.
Pretty sure you
It's
just.
a field replaceable unit.
Yep.
Thank you, Brendan. So field replaceable, you just swap it out. We don't open it up. We're not electricians. That's not our goal. What about capacitors, Prashant?
Isn't that also used for electrician work or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
They store charges, is what a capacitor is. And again, it looks like a battery that's like soldered down to a motherboard. So it looks like a little battery sticking up. And the whole point of pressing and holding that power button is to disperse the charge in those capacitors. If you ever see a capacitor swollen or cracked, whatever it's soldered to is now a paperweight. It is no longer any good. But we'll talk about that when we do motherboards tomorrow. All right, so any components that you utilize, always make sure you're holding them by the edges and not touching the pins or the chips on top, because we have oils on our fingers, and or ESD is still a, though a minor possibility. If we have an ESD mat, it's still a possibility, and we don't want to run the risk. So hold it by the edges and be gentle in laying them down. And we still have oils on our fingers that can cause corrosion to the metal components and pins on a chip. So once again, just reiterating before we open it, power down the computer, unplug all external connectors, press and hold the power button for 3 to 5 seconds to discharge any residual electricity. Questions? All right. Once we're done here, everything's unplugged. We've dispersed the electricity. Now we can have fun and crack the case. There's a few different ways that can do this, either through screws, or a lot of them just have a panel on the side that can clip and pop open. Some of the more frustrating ones have the panel that you have to remove from the front. But again, those are kind of rare. Most of them will be like this one here or this one up to the side, where you just take the screws out of the back. Now, when removing screws from the back, make sure you're only removing the ones you need to. Because sometimes there's a hole cut in it through the metal, and that would be a screw for the power supply. And you don't necessarily need to unscrew that. So make sure you're only hitting the screws that you need to accomplish what you want to accomplish. All right. When you start unplugging any cables, look at the board before you unplug it. If you look down on the board and you see a little yellow triangle, that little yellow triangle is an indicator that you're at the corner closest to pin 1. This helps you orient how the cable is supposed to go in. Most have clips, so they can only go in one way. Some don't. Some we have to look for this little yellow triangle. One of the biggest ones for that would be CPUs. But even they have notches on them now, so they can only go in one way. But on the CPU and on the motherboard, you'll have a little yellow triangle, and that's an indicator that you're nearest to pin 1, the first pin. Questions on this? All right, so we've cracked the case. We're going to locate the major components first. including the power supply, motherboard, drives, follow their connections. And if we're removing everything, we're going to start disconnecting things. Making note and taking pictures as we go along. Obviously, before we start, take our ESD bracelet, our gloves on, or what have you, and ground ourselves to the machine. All right. Again, continue to take pictures along the way. First, we're going to want to start hitting those expansion cards. They typically have a plug. They may have a plug if they need additional power, but a lot of times it's just a simple screw, and then we can remove the cards. Now, when removing the card, if the card is sitting in like this, okay, we do not rock it side to side like that. That's a really good way to snap the pin or snap the card. We want to rock it edge to edge if we have to wiggle it. So not back and forth, edge to edge if we need to. That'll prevent damage to the card. Same holds true for RAM modules, things like that. And again, don't touch the chips with your bare hands. If you have them, anti-static bag, you can store that in there, or if you have an anti-static mat, you can lay them out on the mat. Making sure not to stack anything. After you've removed the expansion cards, move on to the RAM. RAM's really easy. They have these fun little tabs on either side. You just take your thumbs, you push down the little tabs, and it kind of ejects the module. Then you grab it by the edges with your fingers, pick it up, and then you can lay it down. And or put it into a anti-static bag. Questions so far? All right. So we're in step 3, removing slot components. After this, we would move on to our CPU. So first do this by removing the fan and the heatsink. Between the heatsink and the CPU, there is thermal paste. And one of two ways, either you can do like a gentle twist and pop it off and it goes. If it does not move easily, one of the nice things to keep in your bag is unwaxed, unflavored dental floss. Because then you can just put it in between the heatsink and the CPU, gently rock it side to side, and you break the seal of the thermal paste and you can pull it off. And when we're unscrewing, we use what's called the X method, which is if I unscrew the upper left corner, the next screw I'm removing is the bottom right corner. And then the upper left, the upper right, and then the bottom left. We do this so we're not flexing the chipsets. Kind of the same principle if you change a tire. You don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 around. You do a cross hatch pattern so that it gets put on evenly. Same thing happens when you're getting to your motherboard. We'll get to that in a second. All right. After this, after you get the CPU off, document the status of the thermal paste. If it is dry and crumbling and cracking, it needs to be cleaned off and new thermal paste needs to be applied. And you don't need a whole lot. It's probably the size of a pea or a pencil eraser. That's about all you need before you reapply the heatsink. Too much and it'll spill over and get on other components, and that's no good. You have to clean it off and then replace it. CPU, like everything else, goes in an anti-static bag.
Is the thermal paste more of a liquid type or a solid type?
It's almost like toothpaste. So it's like a thicker toothpaste.
Are you keeping everything in their own separate electrostatic bags?
Correct, because we don't want to stack things, right?
So like if I have two cards of RAM,
Yeah.
separate bags?
Yes, or if you have a nice clean work area, you can kind of lay them out next to each other, just not touching. So you can lay them out on your mats. Like I have a silicone mat that has like, you know, ESD. And so I will lay all my components out on that mat, and they tend to be safe that way. So it's depends on what you're working with. So after we do the CPU, step 4, we're going under our main components. So our power supply would be next. Make sure everything is disconnected. It's disconnected from the case. Then we would unscrew the power supply and remove it and set it aside. Some older units actually have the power supply on a hinge, so it can just fold out. Those are kind of nice. But a lot of them you actually have to unscrew and pull the actual unit itself out. And we move on to our front panel connectors, which is what attaches our motherboard to our front panels. So our power buttons, our headphone jacks, the little lights that light up when our hard drive is operating or the disk drive is operating, you know, all that stuff are front panel connectors right here. All those need to be disconnected before we can remove the motherboard. System fans and all that stuff for your case. If you have any of those, unplug all your SATA and PATA drives. Also making sure, again, taking pictures along the way to make sure we have a roadmap when we put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once we have all that fun stuff removed, we're down to just the motherboard, and we use that X pattern again. So screw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a cross hatch pattern. And typically all the motherboard screws are the same size, so you can kind of put those in there in a single cup. And when you are pulling the motherboard out, do not bend or flex the board. It got in there without being flexed, it can get out. You may have to bend it, twist it, and kind of maneuver it a little bit to get out, but do not bend or flex. You can twist it and do whatever, but we don't want to break any of the welds or solders on it. So hold it by the edges and you should be able to get it out. All right. Then you can set that on your ESD tray or an anti-static bag if you have one handy for that. And with that, we have everything out. We should be looking at a beautiful empty case ready to go. In my cohort, this was one of our tests. We had to take a computer, field strip it all the way down to the frame, and then the teachers would come by, check us off, and then we had to put it all the way back together, pass post, and then we passed that test. So it was a little bit different. But we have a fun little video. Oops, I got to share sound, which kind of shows this being done. And we'll be using the simulators to take things apart and put things together as well. So it's the best we can do without physically having a computer. All right. So here we go. Let me know if you have sound when we start playing. Give me a thumbs up.
You may already know that there are many important parts inside a computer, but what exactly do they do? Let's take a look inside and learn about the various components that make a computer work. Whether it's a desktop computer or a laptop, every computer has a large circuit board called a motherboard. This contains some of the most important parts of the computer, such as the CPU, also known as the central processing unit or processor. The CPU can be considered the brain of the computer because it processes information and carries out commands. Since it tends to get hot, it's covered by a piece of metal called a heatsink, which draws heat away from the processor. The motherboard also contains the computer's RAM, or random access memory. This is the short-term memory that the computer uses whenever it's performing calculations. However, you cannot store your files there, because the RAM is cleared when you shut off the computer. The hard drive provides long-term storage, keeping all of the computer's data even when it's turned off. Many hard drives use a magnetic platter to store data, but many newer computers have solid-state drives, which are faster and more durable, but also more expensive. On many desktop computers, the motherboard has expansion slots that allow you to upgrade by adding expansion cards. You can add a video card to get better graphics performance, or you can add a wireless card to connect to your wireless home network. Most laptops, however, don't have expansion slots. Of course, the computer's components need electricity to run. The power supply unit is designed to take power from the wall outlet and send it to all of the different components that need power. Laptops also contain a built-in battery that lets you use them anywhere. A computer is a pretty complex machine, but now that you've seen what goes on inside, it should be a little less mysterious.
Are you talking?
You're on mute, Kel.
You're on mute. Yeah.
Awesome.
you're muted.
I love talking to myself. Any questions so far where we're at? Nice little summary. Kind of wrap things up. No? Anybody getting glossy-eyed?
I got a question.
Yes,
Why when you why does HP ask you to change your computer out every 4 years?
it's called planned obsolescence. Because they can sell you another computer in 4 years. If they could get you to change out your computer every year, they would.
No, because I had a business and like because we're connected with this IT company every 4 years, they want us to change out the computer, which usually drives you nuts.
Yeah, and the thing is like it could be like there could be some security upgrades in the newer machines that make it better, but it depends honestly on what you're doing, whether you need to do the upgrades. When I was in logistics, the newest computers we had in the company were like 10 years old. Those were the new ones. You know, so it really depends on what you're doing, you know, what kind of processing powers you need. And as long as you're able to handle the operating systems, then it's really up to you as with regards to upgrades, what your budget can handle and, you know, what capabilities you need.
Yeah, we were in the shipping industry, so
I get you. So yeah, I mean, I was with the company I worked for was multinational. It was one of the largest, like top 10 logistics companies in the world. And like I said, the newest computers were 10 years old. Because that's what they needed. It worked. They had no need to upgrade. So it really depends. All right. Quiz time. I'm going to pause the recording real quick.
Can you drop the link again, please?
So we got to put everything back together again now. First step would be putting that motherboard back in carefully. Remember, we don't bend or flex the motherboard. You just kind of change the angles on it a little bit and move. Remember, we're moving in 3 dimensions, not 2. So it's not just shifting around like this. Sometimes you can tilt and angle it and put it in that way. Once back in, make sure the screw holes line up. So the exterior components are pointed out the back of the computer. We set the motherboard on it properly. We utilize the X method when screwing it back in. So we'll do upper left, bottom right, bottom left, center. when we're securing those things together, so we're not flexing or running the risk of cracking the motherboards. Again, this is plastic or silicone that we are screwing down to metal. So we don't need to crank down on the screwdriver. It's almost like finger tight and 1/2 turn. So you get it all the way in there until it's fully screwed in, and then just 1/2 turn with the screwdriver, just making sure it is firmly in there. You don't need to bear down on it. You do that, you're going to crack the board. All right, 2, all drives and fans go back into their housings. Once we have those back in place, step 3, connect all cables to the board, SATA, IDE, PATA, front panel, all those fun little connectors, making sure everything is reconnected. After we do that, step 4, attach the power supply back into place, making all the power connections, including the board and its components. Step 5, place the CPU back in using what's called a ZIF, which means stands for zero insertion force. There's a little hatch that flips over the CPU, and then it locks down. We'll show that better when we work on the CPU, when we do the CPU module next week. So you'll have a better look at it. But it's called ZIF, zero insertion force. Many of you may remember that from the readings. All right. After that, thermal paste, make the sandwich. So you have the CPU, thermal paste, heat sink, fan. Get all that in, put it back in place. Use your X pattern to screw the CPU fan back in place. Some of them have clips, makes it a little nicer. After that, so once we have our CPU back in place, we put our RAM in, locating the notch slot, making sure we're putting them in the correct RAM positions. We'll talk about how to identify that tomorrow. But if we're using dual channel, like Jose was mentioning, you can't just put it in slot 1, slot 2. Depends on the motherboard. Many of them have staggered slots that are connected. So it'd be slot 1, slot 3, or slot 2, slot 4. We have to understand how our motherboard is set up. Thankfully, many motherboards color code their RAM slots so you know which ones go together. So they'll have, like if you're looking at 4 RAM slots, it'll be like red, black, and then you would put the 2 RAM modules in the red, and those 2 would work together. So if you only had 2. If you have 4, it doesn't really matter.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
When you want to apply the thermal paste, do you apply it onto the CPU directly, or do you think you apply it onto the heatsink first?
Typically, it goes on the CPU. Now, if you bought a new heatsink or cooling unit, it may have a thermal pad that is already applied to the heatsink. So you may not have to do it at all if you're putting new components in, which is really nice. So you don't necessarily have to put, but you just have to know which one you're working with. If it's an older component and you're switching it out from another computer, you're going to have to apply it yourself. If it's new, it likely already comes with it on.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right, so after we get the RAM in, time for our expansion cards, graphics cards, sound cards, all that fun stuff. Put those in. If they require additional power, make sure we plug them in from the power supply, all that fun stuff. Then we put the case cover back on according to the directions. It could be the clip, it could be screwed back on, whatever. We put the case back on. Number 9, attach all external connectors, including your monitor, mouse, USB connections, power cords, all that fun stuff. Press the start button, turn it on. Listen for any unusual noises or smell of electrical burning. If you have any burning smells, unplug it immediately. Document any errors. Remember we talked about post errors last week? They had that little postcard, power on self-test. This is the point when you would hear something like that, most likely. If you were going to hear it, now's the time. After you took it apart, and then you'll get the beep, 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 and then it won't turn on. Then we got to figure out what happened. So that is when you would see it at this last part where we turn the power on and turn it on and praise, the final step, obviously. So we think we have a good idea how to put a computer back together, take it apart, and then you start with the motherboard, slowly put Humpty Dumpty back together.
Yeah.
Decent idea.
Yep.
Yeah. I have a
Okay.
quick question. So,
Yeah.
when it comes to building those computers, I was actually looking into doing a project like that, but I know there are companies that sells the desktop like empty, or where it comes with like it comes with the motherboard. All you have to do is buy the remaining components and just kind of install it yourself. Do you think it's a better idea to go that route, or just start from scratch? Where you get,
Honestly,
like,
it's personal preference. If you're building it yourself, you're getting exactly what you want. You are building it to your specs for what you want. If you buy pre-made units, likely you're building, kits. You're buying a kit, and so it may have components you don't need. It may not have stuff you want. So for personalization purposes, building it yourself is the best way. It still may be more expensive than the kits, but again, for most people, the kits are just fine.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So, I mean, I hate to, go the, it depends. But yeah, I mean, in this case, it really does depend. It's a personal preference thing. Some people are just like, it's mine. I want to put my stamp on it. I want to make it look the way I want it to look. So I'm going to build it. And again, it's kind of like people's car, like some people's cars. This is like an art piece to them. They want it to just, really show off their personality or their style and stuff like that. And there are people that do that with their computers as much as people do with their cars too. Some people, it's just a machine to do work. I don't care what it looks like as long as it functions.
Yeah, I'm trying to personalize it. So
there you go.
I need as much RGB as possible.
There you go. As many LEDs as I can get. I want it to blind anybody that walks into the room after me.
Yeah, those lighting looks really pretty cool.
I want to turn it on and see the face of God.
There you go. I mean, I'll show you some examples of various ones that people have just kind of gone to the extremes on their computers, and there's some really cool stuff. But we'll get into that in a little bit. And it's kind of neat what some people come up with and do with their machines. So we're going to practice putting these back together. So we have a matching game. I knew you were excited going, please, 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 one more quiz. Pause the recording.
That's how it starts. And then it'll go away.
Yeah. It eases over time.
Yeah, that's gonna be a hard habit to break. Doing something you know how the way you do it to the way CompTIA wants you to do it.
We will work on it though, Jose. You'll get there. So this brings us to the end of our tour of the inside of the computer, just to kind of touch on the different components we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. By now, we should be able to a degree, describe and identify some key components inside of a PC or tower. And then, to a degree, name the steps for taking it apart and putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, revelations?
When are we going to be able to access these videos on YouTube?
The ones for this week I should have up on Friday. So, and remember, I only do this with technical sessions. So this is our second actual technical session. We had one last week, then this one, and then we're going to have 2 tomorrow. So there'll be 4 going up this weekend or this Friday. Any other questions?